Hello and welcome to the Q&A session for the sixth webinar in round 2 of the NDIS Success Program, which is on sustainability in the NDIS. Community Business Bureau acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respects to them and their cultures and to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Dimitri and I'm a business consultant with CVB. I'll be your presenter today, going through the questions we have been asked in the past week since the Sustainability NDIS webinar went live. I'm joined by Andrew Ellis, who is one of the other business consultants in our team. Thanks to those who submitted questions. We would also appreciate if you would share your own experiences of the NDIS on the CVB NDIS Success Forum online on our social media. Starting a new NDIS service can be challenging. It can be valuable to learn from other providers how they are overcoming barriers and problems. We'll try to answer your questions to the best of our knowledge and by drawing on our experience working with over 100 providers transition to the NDIS and our ongoing support of NDIS providers. We are, however, not the NDIA and we do not give legal advice. If you are unclear or in doubt, always check with the NDIA. We have grouped questions for today in 2 different themes: revenue, costs, worker utilisation, processes and targets.
So getting into the first series of questions we've got on revenue, Dimitri, how regularly do you think providers should review the price guide to make sure that they're staying up to date and invoicing for everything they can?
Yeah, look, you don't need to sleep with the NDIS price guide under your pillow. However, we strongly recommend that you regularly review the requirements and stay up to date with the price guide changes. Last year, we counted 6 updates to the NDIS price guide, as well as the rules and regulations. And this year, we've seen several amendments due to COVID-19. Under the NDIS terms of business, providers are required to adhere to the price guide. In our consulting work, we often notice that providers are not up to date with recent changes. Some providers charge incorrectly or miss out on opportunities to increase their prices or charge under different items, thus affecting revenue. It's a good idea to have a person in your organisation who is responsible for keeping up to date with price changes. This person should look out for communication from the NDIS, but also check the information for providers on the NDIS website. I would also encourage you to subscribe to CVB's Free Forward blog as we try to publish regular summaries on important changes to the price guide or other regulations. I would also mention that under Australian consumer law, you're bound by the service agreements that you have established with your customers. So you therefore may want to include a clause that prices and terms and conditions can be changed according to the NDIS price guide updates.
Excellent. So how can someone ensure that they're invoicing correctly or appropriately and doing so for all services that they're allowed to under the NDIS price guide?
Yeah, again, it's important to understand the price guide and the NDIS support catalogue. There are a range of questions you should ask. Does the participant have the necessary funding to purchase the support from you? Has the participant agreed to purchase the service from you? When providing the service, you need to keep records of date, start and finish of services, location, who provided the support, and ideally the participant should sign that they have received the service. If the support involves provider travel or participant transport, you need to record the travel time and the mileage as well. You also need to keep records of services that have been cancelled, declined or postponed. Record communications, comments or concerns raised by the participant or the family members that relate to the support provision. If the support is a capacity building support, you should also document how your client is tracking against their goals. Records of wellbeing, mood and health can also be valuable.
Excellent.
So I just thought I'd ask you a few around the area of costs. How can I estimate my setup costs is one of the questions that recently came through.
Yeah, so this sort of goes back a little bit to the 3rd webinar that we did looking at service design and also I guess dovetails into financial sustainability under the sixth webinar that we've done. So figuring out your startup costs, you're best off to start off by building a list of what those setup costs are that you think you might incur. And if you add to your list some details about, what the justification is for the numbers that you're using in figuring that out. So if starting a new NDIS service means hiring a new person, they need a laptop, they need a mobile phone, they need whatever other software and things like that. So start listing out those sorts of things that you're going to need as part of those setup costs. And it's useful if you've put down having a laptop as one of those startup costs, to rather than just put a dollar amount down, just to actually look for a brand or where you're going to buy it from and things like that, and use that level of detail to start building it up. It's worth looking at things that you might purchase from external providers, and if you need to do that, then best practice would be to obtain a couple of quotes. Perhaps not for the small items, but certainly for any significant dollar value items, it's worth getting a few quotes to shop around. If you can't get quotes for some items, I'd estimate the price and a bit of a brief explanation as to how you've come up with that number. And I guess, we've talked before about a budget is never going to be perfect, and it doesn't matter, what happens, you're never going to exactly hit the budgeted number. So it is useful to have a bit of contingency sometimes when you're putting a list of things like this together to start services. There might be other things that come out of the blue. There might be some things that cost a bit more than you'd initially said. So maybe having 10 or 20% on the bottom line as a contingency to the numbers that you've built up would be useful, just to factor in anything that might come up that you couldn't foresee at the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And just building on that, how can an organisation estimate their future costs?
So again, it's about building up a list of those, starting with building up a list of the sorts of activities or, things that are likely to be costs for you. So in building that up, you need to consider the objectives of your organisation, the aspirations for the NDIS service, how many people you want to serve, how large you want to grow. So a lot of that really stems from, strategic plan, business plan. I was having a conversation with a client yesterday in a workshop about building up a financial model for them, and they were going to start with the FTE that they could sort of see growth in, and then kind of use that to factor in what's the cost of those staff, what's the chargeability of those staff, and they could build out a model almost based on their kind of forward projection of the headcount. Some items can be difficult to estimate in future. But I think if it's about just sort of putting allowances there for everything, and there'll be unders and overs. And it's good to have perhaps a little bit of fat in there, a little bit up your sleeve. Always better when you're reporting upwards to under promise and to over deliver than to do it the other way around. I feel like you're chasing your tail. So some of the things to include when you're putting these costs together: salary and wages, and in many instances that's going to be the major cost. Rent and facilities related costs are probably going to be the next biggest thing. And then all the other stuff: power, internet, phones, computers. There might be other tools of the trade or consumables. So, it's about the builder, for example, having a drill or a hammer to use to do whatever. All sorts of workers across the different fields within disability services will have different tools of the trade or consumables that they need to use. So including allowances for those into your costs as well. Insurance is a big one and can be quite a significant cost. Marketing, promotion, printing is also important to factor into those costs as well. So that's how you go about trying to estimate your future costs. And I guess you're writing down a list, you're building it into a spreadsheet. Probably the spreadsheet would be, month on month. You want to measure on that kind of basis and then build up to an annual budget or estimate. So next question is, I need to get board approval for investment in growing or starting an NDIS service. What sorts of things should I include in the financial part of the business plan?
Yeah, so look, starting at the very top, you want to answer the question of how revenue will be earned. So specifically, what NDIS services will you provide? And then drawing on some of Andrew's comments just now, what are the setup costs to be able to provide these NDIS services? What are the direct costs associated with providing these NDIS services? So again, drawing on webinar 6 earlier, direct costs being the hourly rate of a direct worker, as an example, being a direct cost. You'd then also like to include the ongoing costs to your organisation. So, these could be things such as rent to a new building and things like that. How many services will you need to provide to break even? This can be a really useful number so that people are aware of just what's actually required to be able to break even and make the new venture financially sustainable. In drawing on that, you'd look at your 12-month sales target. What are you looking to achieve in the next 12 months from a revenue perspective? And these considerations will come into how you measure each in terms of KPI creation. So you may want to have a handful of KPIs that effectively keep everybody on the same page and helps you report your progress towards some of those goals. And it can be really useful to visualize some of these KPIs in a graphical sense so that people are able to get across them really quickly and easily.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. I think some of it is, I guess this question's been focused really on the business plan and having some targets, and then ultimately as you move forward you need to measure against those targets. And you mentioned, for example, one of those points there being a 12-month sales target, and I know in a previous role and organisation that I was in, we had a sales target for one part of our NDIS business, and we also kept tabs on the sales each week and month through the course of the year, so that we could actually measure that sales against the graph that we had as the target. All of that was used to predict future revenues, and it was also really important to have that information to be able to predict future workload. And so those, the purpose of all these financial reports and visualizations and things is to help management make better decisions, or to help the board make better decisions. I know we've talked about that plenty of times before. We're big on that here. And so using that information to be able to guide the decision making on recruitment and bringing new staff on, and also being able to direct or redirect marketing activities is really important as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the next question that comes up is, what's a reasonable timeline for recovering that initial investment?
That's a bit like how long's a piece of string. There's so many different factors, and I think it gets a bit to the strategic appetite and the risk appetite of the organisation as well. So the timeline for recovering your investment is going to depend on a couple of things. It's going to depend on the size of the initial investment. So if it's a smaller initial investment, it might be a quicker recoverable time, and it's also going to depend on the net income generated from your new NDIS service. So often, the higher the net income, or the higher the revenue that you're able to charge per hour or per line item for those services, is going to give you a quicker recoverable time as well. I think if you've got flexibility, it is useful to undertake some different scenarios when you're going through your planning phase, and it might be useful to look at whether it's an optimistic or a conservative, both those extremes, in terms of doing a model around what if we invest more upfront, what will that look like? What if we invest less upfront, how will that look? There's plenty of organisations that I've seen and known that just want to make a bit almost organic but incremental investment and then get a return, and then use that return to be able to keep growing into the future. But different organisations, even different markets, will have, you might want to be more aggressively targeting certain markets than others, and putting more into it that way. So definitely scenario modelling is going to help with being able to see what's the best option for you. So another question we've got is that we need to understand which of our NDIS services is making money and where we might not be making money. So what sorts of metrics, Dimitri, should we look at when trying to figure out where you're making money or not.
Yeah, as a starting point, look at total revenue per service. Services not generating a lot of revenue may not be at a scale enough to cover basic costs. So that's a really good starting point. Sounds basic, but ensure that you're invoicing for all of the NDIS services that you can. Ensure that you're invoicing the correct amount for your NDIS service and have increased your prices as per the NDIS price guide updates. Then have a look at direct worker utilisation rates as a percentage of their overall paid time. Many of the NDIS price points require organisations to achieve utilisation rates of 70, 80% or even higher. Additionally, you want to look at indirect costs and cost efficiencies. If you have a range of different types of services, it may be useful to allocate revenue and costs of each to certain codes in your chart of accounts to make it possible to analyse job costs or similar and look at gross margins of each service. So, in that way you can compare apples with apples and see how one service is stacking up against another as such. So some key metrics to look at could include revenue per direct worker, revenue per all workers, direct worker utilisation, and of course your net profit margin.
Excellent. So also getting into how we're analysing where the money's going, what do you think is the best way to apportion corporate overheads across the NDIS services?
So this will obviously depend on your organisation's size and strategic objectives. Two simple ways that you can apportion corporate overheads include applying a flat fee, such as 10% of NDIS service revenue. And another way is to use a percentage of total revenue. So for example, if your NDIS service revenue makes up 20% of your organisation's total revenue, then you may decide that you're going to allocate 20% of the corporate overheads to the NDIS service. I'll just note that the structure of your chart of accounts is one of the best tools that can be used to build an understanding of the corporate overheads. If you have the right structure in your accounts, then you should be able to calculate these rates mentioned based on your budget.
Yeah, and I've seen, you probably have as well, in a number of organisations before where the chart of accounts is sort of morphed over time and it isn't necessarily easy to be able to strip those line items out. And so whenever you're watching this, if you're getting towards the end of financial year or the start of a new financial year, that's probably the best time to make any sort of material changes to your chart of accounts. So you don't have to go through and deal with sort of messy changes, but it is useful to regularly look at that chart of accounts and see if there's any improvements that can be made that will help you to be able to analyse and understand this better as well.
Yeah, and your ability to analyse your accounts and your financials really is largely determined by how well you record and organise that information as it comes in. So just moving over to worker utilisation now. Question for you here, Andrew. How do you measure worker utilisation and how often?
Yeah, great question. Ultimately, this comes down to some use of some form of timesheets and staff recording when they're working on client work versus admin work or leave, training, internal meetings, all the other things that we expect our staff to do from time to time, travel even as well. And you need to be able to use that timesheet system to be able to have that accountability of knowing, what clients' work that your staff are working on then as well. So there are mobile apps and software around these days. Since the NDIS has started, there's been a number of those sort of tools that have come up that you might be able to look into. But in simple terms, it's about tracking how many hours a day your staff are involved in direct service provision, in chargeable work, basically. So that becomes your chargeable time, and then you can gain an understanding of how much time your staff are spending on non-chargeable time or in activities that can't be invoiced. And I think this has been one of the big challenges for many organisations since coming into the NDIS is having to have an accountability and higher targets for that than what many organisations probably had previously. So for myself personally, my kind of work background, I spent a number of years in an engineering consulting environment even before the NDIS came along. So I was familiar with working in a consulting environment, and in that setting, and as I am seeing in other organisations now with the NDIS, weekly reporting is so important on chargeability, because if you get to week 4 of the month and you look at your chargeability for the month that's been, the results already done and dusted and behind you before you realise that you might have a problem. So weekly reporting in the aggregate is so useful, being able to determine if you've got too low or too high utilisation, because ultimately this is the best leading indicator you're going to have for what your revenue for the month is going to be. If your utilisation is down, revenue in the month is going to be down, and vice versa. This is the best way of knowing if you're on track for your monthly result.
Yeah, and for many NDIS providers, staff wages will be by far the biggest cost. So tracking worker utilisation is absolutely key. So just on that, how can you improve worker utilisation?
Yeah, well, what gets measured gets done. So if you're not measuring it at the moment, then you need to do that first. So tracking time efficiently is really important. Analysing worker utilisation regularly is also important. And I think it's important to set reasonable goals and expectations. And I saw that myself when I was working in an NDIS provider, when we just started delivering NDIS services and having to go through an education process with staff working in that area about how we record their time and how we look at their activities and what is chargeable versus non-chargeable. And so we started just to build some data before we actually set a target. And then once we built that data, we could figure out what a reasonable estimate would be for having those targets. So set reasonable goals. It's not reasonable to expect your staff to be 98%, chargeable and utilised, because there's important training and other activities and cultural activities in terms of the organisation that are important to promote as well. You can improve the efficiency for how you're figuring this out by using software and systems, and having the right tasks done by the right people. So one of the reasons that if your utilisation rates aren't what you want them to be, you need to, as with any other management process, dive into why that is. And maybe it's because you've got resources who could be chargeable at high rates that are actually doing basic admin work that could be done by somebody else. And so maybe bringing an admin resource in takes some of that admin work away, and you can actually have your chargeable people doing more chargeable work. Regularly review your staff rosters, your timetables for service provision, and managing the people part of all of this and the culture part of all of this plays an important part as well. It's not just about financial, it's about ensuring staff understand what their own individual and even their team targets are, and having regular reviews and reports to help identify where there's issues, and might need conversations with staff in terms of education or training in the first instance, and then potentially even performance management later on.
So somewhat of a controversial question and a bit like a piece of string, but what is a realistic worker utilisation target?
Well, as we understand it, the NDIS model for disability support workers assumes utilisation of them at 92%. That might be achievable if a worker just turns up to site, delivers the service, and that's it. But that might not be appropriate in all circumstances. But it does depend a bit on the type of service that it is that you're providing, and other types of service could have lower rates of utilisation. But I'd say as a rule of thumb, if your utilisation is below 60 or 70%, then you probably want to have a look closer and figure out if you've got an issue there and what's driving that. And as I said, ultimately it will depend on the type of service, the nature of the service, and where it's provided, and how your organisation is structured with things like supervision, team meetings, training, and who's doing the admin tasks that are really important to keep things going. So we're going to shift gears now and talk about processes. And so, Dimitri, how can you improve an organisation's invoicing processes? What would you do there around invoicing?
Yeah, so that word process really comes into it. And the first thing I would say is have a defined process that at a minimum includes a defined time that you invoice. So this could be directly after providing the service. And this might be necessary to guarantee your cash flow, or alternatively, it could be batched weekly. And this will be more efficient. However, it will take longer to get paid. Other things to include in your process can include, specify who in your organization will invoice. Make sure that more than one person in your organization understands the invoicing process. The staff member responsible for the invoicing might be absent at some stage, and you will need a contingency plan. Specify how the invoice will be checked for accuracy before it's sent. You should also provide a copy of your invoice or monthly statement to your customers for transparency and to allow them to also track their spending.
That's good. So we know within the NDIS that we've got agency managed plans, we've got plan managed, and we've got self-managed. How do you handle different invoicing procedures for each of those?
Yeah, so the first thing I'd say is to create a defined system for how you invoice for each particular type. And then when you set up a new client in your CRM or your financial system, make sure that your intake process captures how they are managed and the details of who and how to invoice. And then ensure that everyone involved in the invoicing procedures are trained in how to use the required systems of each, and just noting that there are different systems for each potentially. So an example of this is that for an agency managed participant, you need to ensure that staff know how to navigate the MyPlace portal, how to submit a service booking, and how to lodge a claim. Also ensure that a staff member reconciles the NDIS payments regularly to identify any unpaid claims.
That's great. So we know probably one of the biggest challenges for organisations as they've transitioned into the NDIS has been cash flow.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you improve your NDIS related cash flow?
So first and foremost, invoice as quickly as possible after the service is provided. Review any outstanding invoices regularly and follow up. And then review if there are any opportunities to delay any costs that you may have and can pay later, even if it's in monthly installments rather than upfront. Can you pay that annual fee over 12 months rather than a lump sum on month one as such?
So you've talked about just there about reviewing the outstanding invoices and following up. So do you want to just dive deeper into that? How should we manage debtors and overdue invoices then?
Yeah, so have a debtor policy and be clear on your payment terms in the service agreement and on your invoice. So if you require payment within 30 days, have that on your invoice. And then follow up when they fall due. So again, having a policy in place and a system in place will allow you to see that if your terms are 7 days, for example, and an invoice hasn't been paid in 10 days, that there's a system and process in there to follow up. You can set up a process for reminders after certain periods of time, such as a polite email reminder at 7 or 14 days overdue to prompt anyone who may have forgotten to pay. Some accounting software can automatically do this for you. As time goes out, more formal letters can be sent at 30, 60, and 90 days. Becoming more serious over time. So including stating that you refer to a debtor collector. You can probably find templates online to how to write these or have these standard letters put together. It might be that you hand it over to a debt collector if it does get too long in the tooth and at 100 days or so, then that may be a decision that you make. Of course, regular reviews of people who do not pay on time or at all might lead you to consider whether or not you actually do want to keep them as a client.
Excellent. So shifting tack a little bit, what accounting software do you think should be used for organisations who are working in NDIS?
So this will depend on the size and the requirements of your organisation. Generally speaking, look for software that is cloud-based, that is secure, which includes knowing where the storage servers are located, that the software is updated regularly, and that it integrates with other software such as your time recording software. Can be really key. It's one of the big advantages of modern day software is that different pieces of software can talk to each other.
Integrate, yeah.
So just moving on now to targets. Andrew, how regularly should targets be reviewed?
It's a good question, and I think ultimately it comes back to your organisation's objectives and what the strategy is. Also probably comes back to what the rhythms of meetings and things like that are in the organisation, whether it's board meetings or management meetings or both. If it's a monthly meeting versus a quarterly meeting. So I think, how you're going against your targets, you should be reviewing at least every quarter. But there are certain things many things you want to be looking at monthly. And even as we've talked about with utilisation rates down to weekly as well. So ultimately it depends on what those targets are. And I guess as we've talked a bit about today, I'll be looking at utilisation reports weekly. Your revenue, your costs, your profitability, your sales, your profit and loss, cash flow, balance sheet, most of those sorts of things usually looked at monthly. And even when there is a quarterly board meeting cycle, management will often produce the reports and the monthly reconciliations and go through and look at that on a monthly basis as well. So ultimately it's going to depend, as we've said, on the size, stability, board reporting structures, those sort of things. I've been involved with organisations where I guess like we've seen in the last 6 months, cash flows have been challenged by COVID or, different things organisations are going through, and when things aren't looking, so wonderful, then you want to be looking at these things more often and not less often. But if you've got a good asset position, stable revenues and stable systems, you can get away with doing it a bit less frequently.
So how do you figure out the break-even point for a service?
So you can do some iterative calculations to help get to figure that out. So firstly, measuring revenue. So your charge out rate multiplied by your chargeability percentage multiplied by the number of hours being worked. And you need to measure your costs. So you're looking at your staff cost multiplied by the staff cost per hour and the number of hours that they're working. So if you've got a staff member who's working, for $40 an hour and 38 hours a week, that gets you to $1,500 or something. If they're able to be charged out at $90 an hour and they're charging 70% of the time, and by the 38 hours that they're working, then that helps you to get to the revenue as well. So in figuring out the staff cost, you need to include and think about not just the base salary, but there's all the on costs as well. So superannuation, the direct on costs, which could include payroll tax, the indirect costs, which would include that person's share of things like the rent and the power, IT, the corporate overheads like we've talked about earlier. And then you need to add in any other expenses as well for travel or training, consumables, equipment, those sorts of things. So you can put a little spreadsheet together that will help you to map those things out, play around a little bit with the percentages or the numbers to suit, and you'll be able to quickly figure out where your break-even point is.
So in talking about cash specifically, what level of cash reserves should be held?
This is a bit like the piece of string. How long's a piece of string thing? It all's going to depend on the organisation's objectives and your risk tolerance as well. Oftentimes 3 months worth of expenditure is quoted as a good number to have for your recommended level of cash reserves, but in some other organisations it might be make better sense to have 6 months. And I guess organisations through COVID have probably been through an interesting test scenario to figure out how much cash reserves you had and how much cash reserves have dipped through the course of a challenge like we've had this year. So that gives you a data point as well to know and get a sense of what that might be. As part of your risk management activities, it'd be worth having a look at worst case scenario projections or issues that you could have to deal with, whether it's a cyber attack takes you out for a couple of weeks, whether it's shutdowns as we've seen, whether it's a natural emergency, or a new competitor takes, some of your clients away. There's different scenarios you could think through and come up with a worst case scenario, and then consider the potential consequences under those conditions as informing as to what you think that it should be. And I guess just a point to note that we're talking about the reserves, cash reserves that you would have that are really sort of set aside for that unexpected event or unexpected situation. And you would want other reserves on top of that base amount that you're putting aside for future investments that you'll need to make in technology, systems, facilities, and even for new service and product development. So, again, some organisations I've seen who've had good, strong balance sheets and cash in the bank, they can deliberately run a couple of years worth of deficit budgets because they want to invest in growing a new program or a new service. You need to be having cash reserves that you're putting aside to replace computers or upgrade your offices and do those sorts of things that is just part of normal business practice as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that future thinking is absolutely key.
But it's really driven by strategy, isn't it?
Yeah.
And what you want to do as an organisation in the next few years. So that gets us to the end of our questions for today. Thank you for watching and joining in. If you have any more questions, then please don't hesitate to post them on our social media or to email us ndis@cbb.com.au. So thanks for joining in today. We'll see you again soon.